If you've ever stared at a blank page and thought, I need to create an entire world and I don't know where to start, this video is for you. I'm Zara Hoffman, the founder of Inimitable Books, and today I'm going to be talking about world building that will help you get started without being overwhelmed to the point that you never actually write your story. Here's what happens to a lot of writers, and I used to be one of them. They decide they want to write a novel, and suddenly they think they need to know everything about their fictional world before they can write the first word. They start mapping continents, creating languages, designing political systems, trying to be the next Tolkien. And you fast forward 3 months later to a year or multiple years, and they still haven't written a single sentence of the actual story. Or they go in the opposite direction. They jump into writing without thinking about their world at all, and then they're consistently having to stop and figure out basic things like, wait, how does magic work in this system, or does this technology even exist in this story? The key is finding a sweet spot between these two extremes. You need to think of your world as an iceberg. Readers only see the tip of it, the parts that directly affect your story, but underneath there's a whole structure supporting what they can see. You don't need to know everything about your world before you start writing, actually, but you do need to know the parts that will impact your characters and plot. The rest you can figure out as you go. For example, in my self-published novel, Obscure Origin, the doors on the alien spaceship are solid, but then dissolve rather than having handles, locks that could be picked, and gaps at the bottom like many doors on Earth. This fact really affected the giant fight scene of the book to the point that I actually had to rewrite the chapter once I realized that it made no sense for those doors to work like human ones. On the other hand, knowing my main character Verity's favorite cocktail wasn't going to matter to the plot, and so I never figured it out. So this is your reminder that you need to start with what matters to your story and then expand outward only as needed. That's what's going to keep you from being overwhelmed. If your story never leaves the capital city of your world, you don't need to map out the entire continent at the beginning. If magic isn't central to your plot, you don't need a complex magic system with multiple subcategories and rules. This doesn't mean you shouldn't think about bigger picture elements, but it means that you need to focus on what the reader needs to understand to follow your story, and then you build from there. Every world has rules, even contemporary fiction does, because if you put your story in the real world, you have to obey the laws of physics, social norms, and legal systems that we all know. In speculative fiction, like fantasy and sci-fi and dystopian, etc., you get to create the rules of the world, but you need to make sure that they're good ones. The most important thing is consistency. If magic exists in your world, how does it work? Who can use it? What are the limitations? And if you're writing science fiction, what technology exists and how does it affect daily life? I'm going to give 2 examples from my own writing that are not through Inimitable Books. In my debut novel, The Belgrave Legacy and its sequels, I had to decide on a magic system. I knew that my main character of the first book, Fawn Belgrave, is a 7th generation witch, which in my world makes her innately more powerful than many other witches who have had more training, like her mom. But I also knew that she needed to have limitations that were not only tied to her level of education, because she is learning throughout the book. So at one point, I have her lose her powers, but I also have certain complicated spells be overtaxing, and it is built into my magic system that if you don't take care of your magical expenditure, then you essentially burn out and need time to recover. But because she's under threat the entire time of the book, that downtime would have been dangerous for her. In my latest self-published book, The Matchmakers, I had to think very hard about the technology for the 23rd century that would exist. And I based a lot of it off of pre-existing science and technology that is either in nascent stages now or is not widely available right now, but then took creative license to bring it into the future and become more common. I can't talk too much about the really big things that I was researching because those are spoilers for the story, but you get the idea. Remember, the rules that you create should be both opportunities and limitations for your characters. The best world building elements do double duty. They make your world feel real and they create story possibilities by forcing your characters into a corner at some point. The more defined your limitations, the more impressive your character's accomplishments become. Because if magic can do anything, then solving problems with magic isn't impressive. But if magic has costs and limitations, like they did in my story and many others, watching your character work within these boundaries becomes compelling. Your world building needs to raise the stakes for your characters and not just provide pretty scenery. Think about how the unique aspects of your world make your protagonist's journey harder or more dangerous. In an example from Inimitable Books, The Storm Gathers by Malin Holiday has a world where witches must create something to channel their magic. Those who don't win their final exam duel against another classmate are denied admission to the academy, where they would go on for extended learning to become even more powerful and also get their talisman destroyed, so they're no longer allowed to do magic at all. One of the three main characters of the book, Nurdel Sue, can't even make a talisman successfully, and so she assumes that's the end of her education journey and makes her all the more desperate to finally make one, even against the advice of her friend. Her desire to succeed at all costs makes her reckless, and it's both a character flaw and also key to her storyline. Every world building element should either support your theme, create conflict, or reveal character, and ideally it should do all three. So here's a little test you can run. For each major element of your world building, ask yourself, how does this make my protagonist's life more difficult? If the answer is it doesn't, question whether or not you need it. You don't need every single part of your world to make something harder. As we all know, email has made certain things much more convenient for people in this world. So you're not only including hardships in the world for your characters, but if you have too many things that are neutral or positive for your character, that is not as exciting for your story. You don't want to explain your entire world in the first chapter. Start with what the protagonist would naturally notice in the scene you're writing and go from there. If they've lived in this world their whole life, they're not going to think this is a fact about where I've lived my whole time, because as someone who lives in New York, I'm not regularly thinking about facts that would interest tourists. I'm just thinking about where I need to go next. They're going to notice things that are unusual, new, or immediately relevant to what they're doing, not what's new to the reader, which is theoretically your entire world. Going back to The Storm Gathers, the Shatter is a mystery similar to the Bermuda Triangle for us. And when they find themselves in the Shatter, they're able to tell readers about their experience as an outsider would. You need to let your readers discover the world through your character's eyes and let them discover it gradually. You don't want to be stopping the story to explain something. Only have it filter through action and emotion so that it's natural and matches how a character would interact with the world, the way you interact with your current world. Your protagonist isn't thinking about how the magic system works in abstract terms. They're going to be thinking about whether or not they have enough to perform a certain spell that they need. Something to remember is that different characters are going to notice different things as well. So a merchant entering a city is going to notice the market and the quality of the goods, while a soldier is probably going to be looking for weak points and fortifications and what the power structure is. You need to use your point of view character's expertise and concerns to determine what world building details they would pay attention to. And whenever you're adding elements to your world that are different from ours, you need to remember that there is going to be a ripple effect. If people can teleport, that's going to change a lot of things. You're no longer theoretically going to traffic, but if everyone's teleporting at the same time, could that cause problems? The ability to teleport affect commerce. Unless there is a tax on being able to teleport, cities are no longer going to get revenue from people taking public transportation. How does that affect communication? Do people need cell phones or letters or any form of communication if you could just snap your fingers, appear in front of the person you need to have a conversation with, and then snap your fingers again to go away? How does that affect warfare? If your enemy can suddenly appear behind you and stab you in the back and then disappear again, that would really change things, right? What about real estate and things like that? If people are able to just move wherever they want to, are people paying for more vacation homes because they can travel there easy? A lot of things to consider. And those are just some examples. In Heirs of Bone and Sea by Kay Adams, which is another one of Inimitable Books' titles, we have a main character, Princess Kalea Marama, who has the ability to raise the dead. And she regularly does this for her father's army. You can see that this power allows the chief of Maremma to be less careful with his soldiers' lives because they can always be brought back. A king or a general who doesn't have that ace in their pocket would have to be much more frugal and careful because they wouldn't be able to just sacrifice lives knowing that they would eventually get them back. Remember that the most believable fictional worlds are ones where all elements have logically affected everything else. You don't want to just add magic or technology for the sake of it. You need to think about how it's going to change the way people live, work, and relate to each other. And world building is not just the physical things. Yes, if a dragon lives outside your home, that is something important. But does the existence of dragons change how people think about the world? Does it change how they think about religion, justice, family, afterlife, etc.? These belief systems affect everything your characters do, and they should be considered just as strongly as all of the accoutrements that we've been talking about, like technology and magic systems. Also, when you are creating your worlds, you want to try to move away from assuming the default is a Western society. There are so many books about different cultures, and you can draw inspiration from those to create your own world. You want to be careful of not committing cultural appropriation, but you can be inspired by another culture that is not yours and take a good idea of theirs and put it into your story. Now, in my book, The Matchmaker, society is now shaped by the core concept that people are given their perfect match by the brightest scientific minds in their country. Each country has their own set of matchmakers, but they are at the top of their game, and they are in a wide variety of scientific fields. They no longer believe in religion because that has led to so many wars in the past, and they are the only ones who are trusted to consider every aspect of an individual's personality and aptitude. The truth is much more Machiavellian, but I'm not going to spoil my own book. However, the practice of these matches and arranged marriages originated after World War IV ends to tie both sides to each other through familial connections. If you have a family member on the other side of another potential war, you're less likely to fight them because you don't want to hurt your own family. And this society places a very high value on family to reinforce that idea. My main character in that book, Rosemary, is completely absorbed by the cultural values in which she grew up. Her older sister actually doesn't agree with them, but she was also raised with the same ones. So even when you have a rebel who rejects their society's beliefs, they are reacting to something specific. So you need to know what the normal is in your world so that you can show how your character relates or doesn't relate to it. I mentioned that in The Matchmakers, people don't believe in religion anymore, but if religion exists in your world, you need to think about how and why it came about. What do people believe about how the world works? If everyone in your world knows for certain that gods exist because they've personally witnessed divine intervention, that would fundamentally change how people think about morality because it's not a theory, they've actually seen it. So in Greek mythology, we know that heroes were very careful to not offend the gods because if you offended a god, you were in trouble even if you had a different deity backing you. In The Storm Gathers, Malin Holiday shows her characters across the spectrum of devoutness. We have Alana Zaya, who doesn't really care about religion, especially with the priest that she has to listen to, who is talking about a certain god as one to be held up and praised, whereas we have another character, Nurdel Su, who has learned that that very same deity is actually the villain in the creation story of their world. So you also need to consider that different locations might change their views of religion and how the world works. We also need to talk about the practical details of a world. How do people make a living? What's the economy based on? It will affect what your characters can afford, what opportunities exist, and what scarcity could exist or does exist to drive conflict. Someone who lives in a world where they are not able to afford the finer things in life are much more likely to become a thief character. If they are born into the lap of luxury, they probably wouldn't take that path. I mentioned earlier in the discussion about teleportation of how would that change people being able to communicate, but how do people communicate in your world? They have to write a letter and then send it. If they are sending it, are they tying it to a bird's leg? Are they putting it on a ship? Are they able to magically teleport it even if they themselves can't teleport? Are there instant messages? Are there reasons why even if you could send an instant message, there's a high cost that makes that less likely to happen? All of these things can dramatically affect your plot's pacing and what information your characters can access. Even in the real world, if you're setting your book in a country that experiences a lot of blackouts, that's going to offer a lot more downtime, potentially panic downtime for your characters if they're not able to access information that they need on a short timeline. Whereas if you put them in the middle of a metropolis where blackouts are very rare, you would have to come up with different challenges for your characters. So don't think that this world building consideration is only for speculative fiction. You also need to think about, what do people eat? Food culture can tell you a lot about the climate, trade, social class, and daily life of a group of people. Knowing what's available to them will make your world feel more real. Also, if they are used to eating a certain type of food and then are traveling, how does that new food affect them? There are people who have a lot of GI problems when they're traveling. Is that true in your world as well? Speaking of traveling, how do they travel? How long does it take? If they have more money, are they able to shorten trips the same way that people who can afford to fly don't have to take as long on a trip as someone who can only afford to take a train? This will also affect your plot's pacing and determines which part of your world that your characters can actually reach. What's the legal system? Who has power and how do they maintain it? Is it corrupt? Is anyone allowed to join that system, or are only certain people raised into the role? These types of questions will determine what your characters can get away with and what consequences are if they get caught breaking the rules. Now, that was a lot of questions thrown at you, and I understand if that feels a little bit overwhelming, but those are just to get you thinking. You don't actually need encyclopedic knowledge of your story before you start writing. But when these questions come up in your story, and they eventually will, you should have thought through the answers at least a little bit so that you're not completely stuck. Here are some world building mistakes that I see in manuscript. First, and surprising no one, is info dumping. You don't want to stop your story's momentum completely to talk about the world. Instead, you need to weave it into the action of the story through the dialogue and the emotions that your characters are feeling. Show it in the context of the story. Second, and this is very big, is having inconsistent rules. Unless you have a very good reason for breaking your rule and you explain it well or show it, which is even better, then you want to make sure that you are holding yourself accountable to the rules that you have set. Otherwise, readers are going to notice inconsistencies and become upset. I mentioned earlier how you don't want to take a Western, medieval, probably European country and make that your default fantasy world by just adding dragons. So you need to think more about how things will change, and this goes back to the ripple effect that I discussed earlier, because your story cannot simply be set in Earth with a twist if you want it to feel real. If it's very surface level and you're okay with that for a first draft, that's one thing, but eventually you want to deepen it. And that would require thinking about that if there are dragons in medieval Europe, that would change a lot of things in society. Would people build roofs with a different material because they have to account for aerial fire attacks? If so, then that probably means a lot of straw and wooden roofs wouldn't be used, but then the other materials that could withstand fire, like stone, would become much more valuable and more expensive. So that would change the structure of society and affect your characters. Are there people who could ride dragons? Would they be considered elite, or are there only dragon hunters? You can look at how to train your dragon for that very question, because you have people who are only hunting them, and then the people who are like, no, we could ride them, we don't need to kill them. You also need to think about, would there be certain areas that are uninhabitable? Maybe they're overrun by dragons, or maybe dragons have completely scorched the area, and that would also affect the agriculture, warfare, and politics. Another mistake is assuming that everyone in your world has modern liberal values, unless there's a specific reason why your fantasy world developed the exact same attitudes that you have in the circumstances that you grew up in. Now, I have a video planned for the future that will talk more about the historical genre, so I'm not going to go too deep into it now, but you need to make sure that your characters think in a way that makes sense, having grown up in the world that you've created. And perhaps the most common mistake is building more world than story. You can get very excited about building fantasy or fictional world, even if it's not fantasy. You get to play God, and that is a heady feeling. But if you're only building a world because it's exciting and you're never actually working on the story that's supposed to take place in it, you're not really being productive. And if you are creating a bunch of world building that's not relevant to your story, even as you are writing your story, consider redirecting your energy into what's actually going on the page. So, what trying from this video? To start, write down the 3 most important ways your world differs from yours. These should be differences that matter to your story. So if there's magic, if the political system is different, if the level of technology or cultural values are different, whatever. 3 things that are different. And then for each of those differences, you want to write down 1 way it affects your protagonist's daily life, 1 way it affects your plot, and what is a limitation or cost associated with it that could serve as an obstacle for your character. Then try writing a scene where your character interacts with one of these elements in a way that reveals the information naturally. It's just an exercise, but it's going to be so helpful to have this practice down when you are writing your book. You can figure out everything else beyond the foundations as you need it, but you want to keep notes as you're doing that so that you stay consistent. And you definitely don't want world building to become a form of procrastination. If this video helped you at all, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future writing advice videos. We also have a world building PDF guide available for purchase through our Ko-fi page, but you will get an expanded version for free if you join our paid writing community, the Inimitable Writing Community, which comes with the course Query Ready, and that goes way beyond just writing a good query letter. You also will get Q&As with me, someone who has worked in the publishing industry for a decade. Links for all of those things are in the description down below. Next up in this playlist, I'm going to be discussing how to create characters readers actually care about, because the best world building doesn't really mean anything if your characters don't feel real. Be sure to drop a comment and let me know what's a world building element that you are most excited about in your story, and if there is a cost to it, let me know what that is as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.